I'm John Henry Westen. Thanks for joining me on Truth and Lies, the show where we work together to shed light on common misconceptions and come to a fuller understanding of the truth. In my work in media, I have found it essential to speak the truth with love. Love for all people, because we are all the children of God. And with that in mind, let's have a look at this week's topic. Is science stronger? Is it more important than religion? Well, let's take a moment to think about that. Do you agree or do you disagree, and why? Is that your opinion? The opinion of someone you know? Perhaps you've not had a chance to think about this issue very much. Well, now is our chance to think about it, to talk about it, and to learn about it. Within this topic, there are many lies that have crept into our culture. I'm going to show you a few of those now, which we're going to address on this program.
What do you think about evolution?
Well, science clearly proves evolution, but Christians still believe that a God created everything. That's stupid.
Do you think there is a lack of equality afforded to the sexes within the church?
Equality between men and women is such an obvious thing, but the church says that women can't be priests. What's up with that?
Why do you think Catholics oppose abortion?
I don't even know. I mean, a fetus isn't even human. But religious people think it's worthy of human rights? It's ridiculous.
Christendom has said that the Crusades were necessary. What do you think?
Religious people can admit the truth about crusades or the burning of women at the stake as witches.
Do you think the Catholic Church doesn't know much about science?
Yeah. Didn't the Catholic Church throw Galileo in jail for believing the world was round?
Do you think the Catholic Church should change its view about birth control?
Totally. I mean, the planet is so overcrowded. But the church won't allow birth control. I mean, they're adding to the problem if you ask me.
Many people of different faiths and levels of scientific expertise see no contradiction between science and religion. Many simply acknowledge that the two institutions deal with different realms of human experience. Science investigates the natural world, while religion deals with the spiritual and supernatural. Hence, the two can be complementary. Many religious organizations have issued statements declaring that there need not be any conflict between religious faith and the scientific perspective on evolution. A 2005 survey of scientists at top research universities found that more than 48% had a religious affiliation, and more than 75% believe that religions convey important truths. Some scientists, such as Francis Collins, former director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, and George Coyne, astronomer and priest, have both been outspoken about the satisfaction they find in viewing the world through both a scientific lens and one of personal faith. This is not to suggest that science and religion never come into conflict. Though the two generally deal with different realms, natural versus spiritual, disagreements do arise about where the boundaries between these realms lie. Sometimes one side crosses a boundary in its claims. For example, when religious tenets make strong claims about the natural world, such as claiming that the world was created in 6 days, as some literal interpreters of the Bible claim, faith and science can find themselves in conflict. Though such clashes may garner print, airwave, and bandwidth headlines, it is important to remember that behind the scenes and out of the spotlight, many cases exist in which religious and scientific perspectives present no conflict at all. Thousands of scientists busily carry out their research while maintaining personal spiritual beliefs, and an even larger number of individuals fruitfully view the natural world through an evidence-based scientific lens and the supernatural world through a spiritual lens. Accepting a scientific worldview does not require giving up one's religious faith. To speak more about science and religion, we have in the studio Trent Horn, apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers. Horn earned a graduate degree in theology from Franciscan University of Steubenville.
Trent, can you tell us maybe to start, how does science relate to God?
Sure. Well, science comes from the Latin word scientia, which just means knowledge. So at one point, for example, in the Middle Ages, science was just a systematic accumulation of knowledge. And it was knowledge of many different types. St. Thomas Aquinas said that theology was a science. It was the study of the blessed, or the science of God. However, from the Middle Ages on to the 17th through the 19th centuries, the definition of science was restricted. Science became what used to be called natural philosophy or natural reasoning. The goal of science was to find natural explanations for observed phenomena. So you would see something in nature you couldn't explain. You might ask, well, why do storm clouds develop? And then you would gather evidence, you would test hypotheses, you'd perform experiments, and science would give you conclusions about the natural world. Now, how science relates to God is that science gives us great information about the world that God created. It helps us learn about the natural world. But science can't inform us about the supernatural world because the instruments of science can't reach there. You can't find God with a telescope or a microscope. So rather we have to use careful thinking, or we have to rely on the revelation God has given us to understand Him. So while science is a great tool at understanding the world, it doesn't teach us everything, and it's dangerous to think that science can give us all the truth there is and ignore God in the process.
Right. But at the same time, I think there has been some sort of evidence from science of God, or of the work of God anyway. Has there not been? I'm thinking, for instance, of miracles. When someone's cured from something, you can observe it, you can look at the data from before and after. It's not explainable, probably.
Sure, I think what many scientists will say is that when someone is cured of a disease, they may say, well, there's a cause for the cure and we don't know what it is. Now, science will document the cure and maybe give us as people of faith to show, well, there probably isn't a natural explanation for this, especially for what you would call a miraculous healing. So science gives us information about the world, and then we use inferences to say, does this point to God or does it point away from God? But I think even more so than the miracles we see in healings we can't explain, might be in the universe itself, that there are things that science can't explain there because science is a part of the universe. It's one of the things that has to be explained. And I think science has given us a lot of discoveries and recent knowledge about the world we live in that do point towards a creator that exists beyond it.
So, like, what are you talking about?
Well, I think one fact about the universe that science can point towards God. Remember, science can't find God directly because God is invisible. He transcends space and time. God isn't a thing that I could find here in the bottom of my cup. But science can show facts about the world that point towards God, like little signposts. So one of the facts that science is heavily leaning towards is that our universe, all of space, time, matter, and energy, began to exist in the past, and the entire universe came into existence from nothing. Now, there's an old saying in philosophy that out of nothing, nothing comes, because if you have nothing, it's always going to be nothing. There's no potential. So if the universe came from nothing, the physical universe, then it follows there had to be a cause of the universe that is immaterial, eternal, since it made all of space and matter and time, and transcendent and personal. And we would, as St. Thomas Aquinas would say, and that is the being we call God. So if science can show us the universe, for example, began to exist in the past, then naturally that points towards a transcendent cause beyond the universe that brought it into existence.
Right, right. Along the lines of science and discovery and these things pointing to God, there is this movement or this field of study, if you want to call it that calls itself intelligent design. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, intelligent design advocates believe that within the natural world, there are more clues or evidences of design. And they say that design is something you can detect scientifically. For example, if you walk along the seashore and you see a bunch of shells arranged to say, "Will you marry me?" Now, you wouldn't just say, oh, that's a very random chance occurrence that the waves kind of put those shells in that formation. You would say, well, no, chance doesn't explain this, and this message, it communicates information. So you would logically conclude there must have been a designer to this message. And what intelligent design advocates say is that within our universe as a whole, there are complex elements. There are things that chance cannot explain that point towards a designer. One of these elements that I discuss in my book, Answering Atheism, are the laws of physics themselves, that we have these laws of nature. And within the laws are constants, these little letters in the formulas that don't change, like you've heard of E equals mc squared, probably. Now c is the speed of light, that's a constant in the formula, and it never changes, it's just set. And there's lots of other constants like that that are set in our universe. And the odds of having them all set just right, like imagine you had a bunch of radio dials with billions of combinations on them, and they all have to be turned just right. And if they aren't, you get a universe that doesn't have any life in it. And so chance can't explain this. The odds of getting a universe that contains intelligent life like you and me, the odds of getting that are worse than getting 10 royal flushes in a row in a game of poker. Now, if you're playing poker with someone and they get 10 royal flushes in a row, what do you think?
They're cheating.
Now, but why do you think that? I mean, what if they say, oh, well, maybe it's just chance?
Oh, it's impossible.
Right. Now, it's possible in the most stretched sense of the word, but you say, no, design's more likely. And so these advocates would say that within either the laws of the universe itself, or even within the smallest parts of our universe, like the components in bacteria that they say could not have evolved over time, these are elements of design that point back towards a cosmic designer.
It's fascinating to me that almost in every aspect of science or the study of the natural, as you progress, as you get more and more and more and more and more advanced, and so then there's all these disparate fields. There, people studying marine biology, people studying this outer space, plants and whatever else. But in every field, and even in human study, the study of the body and our own biology, all of a sudden they get to this outer zone where nobody else understands anything, but the scientists that are there, they find this unbelievable complexity, this unbelievable beauty, and they're stunned by it. It's like, whoa. But it's almost not understood by everybody else who's not into that field. But each of them, in their own spheres, keep on finding this beautiful new complexities, new areas of study, like whole worlds, if you will, where they can continue their exploration.
Oh, absolutely. That science, as it's progressed, has revealed the beauty of the universe, its intricacy, and design at many, many layers. So when you start with these basic laws of physics that are finely tuned, they control what happens even at the subatomic level. So the idea that our bodies are composed of atoms we can't see with the naked eye, but even those have to be just right. Inside the atoms, if you were to zoom into my hand, you'd find these little atoms. You have the little nucleus and the electrons flying around. It looks like they orbit the nucleus like a planet. And those electrons, they have to be in special fields. If they were all to clump together, you couldn't have complex organic life. So there's something called the Pauli exclusion principle that governs even what happens at the tiny atomic layer. And so when you zoom out at the whole universe, you see this interconnectedness. And actually, Pope Benedict XVI, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, when he wrote his book, Introduction to Christianity, he said that one of the evidences of God is that the universe is intelligible. That you see this design, this plan through every facet of it, from the smallest atom in my finger to the galaxy that's a billion light years away. You see that it's intelligible and understandable, and that points towards that designer that made it that way.
Absolutely. I think one of the funniest things I saw was one of the chief atheists of the world asked sort of a question about this by, I believe he's a Hollywood actor by the name of Ben Stein. A movie of his was called No Intelligence Allowed. And
Expelled, yes.
Oh, Expelled,
yeah.
That's right. No Intelligence Allowed was the subtitle there. And in there, maybe, do you know that story?
Yes, I have seen the film.
So what transpired?
Well, I remember it's sort of the climax of the film at the very end. So Ben Stein, as some of our viewers may remember from his role in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So Bueller, I remember he had that role. So Stein made this film about intelligent design advocates and their role in the university. And he was trying to explore the intersection between evolution and the concept of design. And near the end of the film, he interviews Richard Dawkins, who's one of, as you said, one of the premier new atheists. He's a biologist, but he wrote a book called The God Delusion. And so he thinks that belief in God is silly, there's no evidence for it. And at the very end, Stein challenged him with this evidence for design, and Richard Dawkins concluded that there could be evidence in the natural world that would point towards a designer. He wasn't prepared to say it was God. He said perhaps it was extraterrestrials or aliens that designed the life we have on our Earth, but he noted the power of looking at design. And actually in my own book, Answering Atheism, I critique Dawkins considered one of the best examples of design in our universe those laws of physics that I told you about, those constants.
Yeah.
Because what Professor Dawkins would say is that in the natural world, in animals, if you can't explain it, well, evolution will figure it out. But that doesn't work for the laws of nature because they were there from the very beginning. So they couldn't evolve over time and get right. You either have a universe with life or you don't. And I critique Dawkins' view that you could get those constants by chance alone, and I think it's very implausible. And the view that God designed our universe so the laws of nature would culminate in intelligent life like you and I makes a lot more sense.
It was amazing to me that one of the foremost atheists in the world, when pressed, having to admit that, yep, it looks like there's some intelligent design, but it doesn't fit within his schema of no God, therefore had to come up with something, and he goes to the aliens. And that's supposed to be more believable than a belief in God. Anyway, that was wild. On this subject, with regard to science and God and confronting science and religion, we often have people talking to us about, well, you religious people, you just don't accept facts. You don't accept evolution by and large. And, obviously we've come from the monkeys, we've shown that definitively. You guys just don't believe it because you're religious and you're not paying any attention.
Yes, there is a common caricature of believers. Now, there are many believers who deny the theory of evolution, but for the Catholic faith, what the Church teaches is that there is no contradiction between believing that life evolved over time, believing in the general theory of evolution, and believing that God exists, He created the universe, and He created human beings with immortal souls. Now, the soul is immaterial, so it can't evolve over time. God created that at a special moment. But what Pope John Paul II said in his encyclical Faith and Reason was that the two can never really conflict. They're like two wings that raise the human spirit. And so if we follow either the scientific evidence to see what it says about the theory of evolution, and we follow what God has shown us about human beings and creating the world, we find they don't conflict because the Church merely teaches that God created the universe. It doesn't dwell on how He did it. And that's the most important point, is that God created the universe with humans in mind, and He made human beings who are special and are made in His image, and so have immortal souls. And what science discovers about the natural world doesn't conflict with that. So there's no problem in affirming the truth of the Catholic faith and the general theory of evolution.
There are certain points in the theory of evolution that is sort of Darwinian or whatever you want to call it, that do conflict with the faith. For instance, if we were to all have evolved from lower species in monkeys and eventually, and there was all sorts of original parents, if you will, and we would have all come and that's how we sort of got there. So these monkey-like or whatever creatures developed into human beings all over the world, and eventually now we have man, and that's that. And what is the problem with that?
Sure. Now, in the year 1950, an encyclical was released by Pope Pius XII about the theory of evolution. And this took place because in the 1940s, what took place was a new synthesis of what Darwin had originally taught in the late 19th century. So there are a lot more findings from genetics and other fields to bolster the theory of evolution. And Pope Pius XII taught in that encyclical, is what I said earlier, there's no conflict in believing in evolution or in believing that man's bodies evolve from lower life forms. So if you have an incorrigible male relative that acts like an ape sometimes, that might be genetic. So our bodies could have evolved over time, and scientists have shown evidence of that. What Pope Pius XII taught in that encyclical, though, is that the laity do not have the same liberty, is how he put it, to believe that human beings originally arose from many different human beings, that there were lots of human beings and not just an original set of parents, a belief called polygenism, versus what the church would teach now, which is monogenism. And to get into the issue, it can be very difficult to seep through genetics and what happened thousands and thousands of years ago that we may never be able to know for sure. But the Catholic faith gives us certainty in matters that science isn't always able to. That scientists may say polygenism is a fact today, but scientific theories change over time. And the church says that this is simply what is taught now, this monogenism, the two parents. But as for the rest of the theory, it can be affirmed by Catholics without any problem. Science is a great tool at understanding the world. It doesn't teach us everything, and it's dangerous to think that science can give us all the truth there is and ignore God in the process.
The church seems to be saying no, and science is saying, but we have all this power. What's the nature of that clash, and why is the church this way?
We have to be careful because even though science says we can do something or we could do something, it doesn't follow we should do it.
Jesus is God, Jesus is Lord, Jesus has the victory.
We all have a call to greatness, a desire for it. We want to do something good.
Now is your time. You could change the world, and the world needs changing, so get busy.
Shalom World, God's own channel.
How science relates to God is that science gives us great information about the world that God created. It helps us learn about the natural world. But science can't inform us about the supernatural world. Then naturally that points towards a transcendent cause beyond the universe that brought it into existence.
Inside the faith, there has been actually a beautiful intersection with science. There have been many scientists who were Catholic, not only Catholic laymen, Catholic brothers and priests as well. Can you explain some of that?
Oh yes, through the Middle Ages, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the church was the one institution that could unite Europe and allow learning and civilization to continue. These manuscripts, these things that were discovered by the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks, they were copied by monks in monasteries to make sure they would always survive. And so the church became a patron of the sciences and was able to glean scientific truth just through religious practice. I mean, much of what early technology related to clocks, for example, came from monks who had to pray with a specific regiment. You know, they're always having to get up every 3 hours to pray. You need something like a clock to do that. And when we look through the history of the church, we see that many great scientists were devoted Catholics or patrons of the church who did not have a conflict between what they believed and what they believed as Catholics and the science that they were investigating. So I spoke earlier about Copernicus, who dedicated a work to the Pope. As you go later in the centuries, you have people like Gregor Mendel. He was an Augustinian friar who discovered the basics, the foundations of genetics, which is the science of how genes, the programs for how living things, from genes in your cells, how living things reproduce, how they pass on those traits. He developed what we now call Mendelian genetics, or the laws of inheritance. And in the early 20th century, there was a Belgian priest named Father Georges Lemaitre, and he is now known as the father of the Big Bang Theory. Prior to his work, scientists believed that the universe was eternal and had always existed. But along came Albert Einstein, and Einstein's theory of gravity, which I said earlier, completely changed Newton's idea of gravity. And with this new understanding of gravity, Father Lemaitre saw that the universe could not be eternal. It could not have been around forever. It had to have begun at a certain point. And his diligent work in the early part of the 20th century helped to bring about the Big Bang Theory we know today. And in fact, the name Big Bang was actually an insult. There was an atheistic cosmologist named Fred Hoyle, and he said of Father Lemaitre, oh, there's the Big Bang guy. He thought the universe started in some stupid Big Bang. Well, the name stuck. And it was eventually vindicated by experimental science, is now called the standard model, or the standard view of how the universe began to exist. and it came from someone who had complete faith in the Catholic Church.
That's fascinating. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah. It's a fascinating story. There's a great book about it called The Day Without a Yesterday by John Farrell. Because what Father Lemaitre postulated was that there was a beginning of time itself. So you'd have a day that didn't have a yesterday.
Right.
And what happened was, so Father Lemaitre studied Einstein, and he actually wrote a paper called The Physics of Einstein. And then he went and met with Einstein and showed other people his theory. This was in the early 1920s, 1930s. Now, in the 1920s, another scientist made observations that coincided with Father Lemaitre's theory that the universe began to exist. He called it the primeval atom. It all began at a point and expanded out. This scientist was named Edwin Hubble, and many of your viewers are probably familiar with the Hubble Space Telescope. And what Hubble discovered, he was at Mount Wilson Observatory in Los Angeles, that he looked out at the stars and saw that the galaxies, the stars were moving away from each other, and they were getting faster as they moved away. And he used a machine called a spectrometer to discover this. And so the only thing that could explain why they're moving away from each other faster was if they were all condensed at a single point in the past, and then it expanded. And so Father Lemaitre promoted this theory, but there wasn't enough evidence to confirm it at that point in the 30s.
Right.
Fast forward about 30 years, in the 1960s, there were two researchers, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson. They were at Bell Laboratories in, I think it was in New Jersey. They were scanning the sky with a radio telescope, picking up all these radio waves. You know that static you get on the radio? Some of it comes from space. And they're listening to this, and they notice that no matter where they point the telescope, at a certain frequency, there's the same sound coming in every direction. And they realized what this was. It was the after effects of the Big Bang itself. That after the Big Bang, the universe was really hot. You got all these photons flying around, really hot. But over time, this heat, it turns into microwaves, and it fills the whole universe. And so billions of years later, they discover this and map it. And it's called the cosmic microwave background radiation. And it convinced everyone at the time that Father Lemaitre was right, and others like Fred Hoyle, who said the universe was eternal and didn't change, were wrong. And so today this is the standard model, and there have been even more discoveries, even this year in 2014, looking at this microwave background radiation. Scientists have discovered that the early part of the universe expanded really, really quickly. It went from the size of a penny to the size of a galaxy in a few seconds. And so scientists are learning more and more about this and confirming what Father Lemaitre and others discovered a century ago. And so it's fascinating that even as we look at these newer discoveries showing what's called inflation, the idea of the universe was like a balloon that inflated really, really fast. Even with that theory, there had to be a beginning point. And a theorem that was published in 2003 called the Borde-Vilenkin-Guth theorem, related to this really fast inflation, shows that in any universe where this takes place, there has to be an absolute beginning. Even if before our Big Bang, there was another Big Bang or another universe. What these cosmologists, these scientists showed, and they're not Christians, they showed that even with these expanding multiple universes, there has to be an absolute beginning. And as I said before, that if there is an absolute beginning, the universe came from nothing, there has to be a cause that's transcendent, a cause that's immaterial, eternal, and really, really powerful. And so naturally that would point towards God. There's no other plausible candidate, and that gives believers a fact that is one of those little signposts that points back to God to show our faith isn't blind faith. It follows the evidence where it leads.
You have some of the biggest discoveries ever made in the field of science are, you mentioned a Franciscan brother, Mendelssohn. Mendel's the P guy, the guy that we have now. We know how to tell if you're going to have blue eyes this way with the little chart, with the 4 squares. Everybody learns that in bio. Although I was never told that he was a Christian brother or a Franciscan, a Catholic monk.
Yes, no, it's, he was Augustinian. But yes, I find that it's very disheartening that religious scientists, people will hear about them, you'll hear in class, so this is Mendelian laws of inheritance or the Copernican theory of heliocentrism, but you don't know that these were very religious people. Whereas modern scientists who who espouse atheism, their atheism is well known. People like Stephen Hawking, one of the world's most brilliant astrophysicists, is forthright in his rejection of the existence of God. Or Richard Dawkins, one of the world's most famous biologists. He's done a lot of great work on the theory of evolution, but people know he's an atheist. People know he's an atheist sometimes before they know he's a biologist.
Absolutely.
And people should see that there are many hardworking scientists who are religious. I mean, the church itself supports science. The Vatican has a telescope it uses and rents out to scientists to help learn about the universe. You have people like Francis Collins. He is an evangelical Christian who is the head of the National Institute of Health. He mapped the human genome. He led the team, I should say, that mapped our genetic code. But there's no conflict between him being a scientist and doing these great discoveries and being a man of faith. And that's why I really love the Catholic Church's position that faith and reason, they don't conflict with one another.
Absolutely. Where there is a conflict, though, because there is sometimes a conflict, it seems to happen, I mean, typically, they say, okay, embryonic stem cells research, new vast area of science, but the church forbids it. There are these places, IVF, it's unbelievable, we're able to make children now, yet the church forbids it. So there are these places of clash where the church seems to be saying no, and science is saying, but we have all this power. What's the nature of that clash, and why is the church this way?
Yeah, I find it unfortunate that people will say this is an example of science versus religion. Because as a religious person, I don't dispute any of the science involved in these ventures. I don't dispute the scientific facts that we discover by looking at embryos and learning about how they function, or the facts related to reproduction in IVF. I don't dispute the science. I dispute the actions that are taking place.
Do science and religion coexist? There are three options. The first option is that science and religion are totally separate fields of inquiry. One view of the relationship between science and faith was articulated by paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould as non-overlapping magisteria, or noma. Gould uses the term magistria to refer to a domain of knowledge. In noma, the two magisteria do not overlap. Science and religion are separate. Science, in this view, investigates objective empirical facts, whereas religion studies subjective questions of ultimate meaning. In practice, however, this approach is not so easy to achieve. Science and religion both address the same world, the same reality. They both impact how we understand and live in our world. The scientist does not suddenly become a different person when he or she enters a church. Both fields make claims that affect the other. The second option is that science and religion are identical fields of inquiry. This view is essentially the opposite of the noma view. It suggests that science and religion must occupy the same space because they seek to define the same world. One of the difficulties of this view is that not all truth claims can be tested in the same way. A historical claim cannot be confirmed via the scientific method. The scientific method is a systematic process of question, hypothesis, testing, data analysis, conclusion, and repetition. Although elements of this process apply to historical testing, a historic event cannot be confirmed via scientific experiment, nor is a historical event repeatable. There are other examples of truths that cannot be adequately tested via the scientific method, such as the laws of logic. Science presupposes logic, the actual existence of other minds, or other metaphysical truths. Yet we all believe logic, the existence of other minds, and many other such truths exist. We seem to have been led to the conclusion that there are certain places where science and religion overlap, but others in which they do not. This is the third view of the relationship between science and religion. The third option is that science and religion are partially overlapping fields of inquiry. This view notes that there are both areas of overlap and areas of uniqueness. Albert Einstein once said that a legitimate conflict between science and religion cannot exist. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Religion includes not just abstract intellectual facts, but also issues of the heart, of intimacy and meaning and destiny. This may be one of the reasons that religion can unfortunately become so contentious. It requires submitting all of our mental faculties to be truly understood. Science and faith are not, in fact, enemies. They both attempt to describe and shed light upon reality, sometimes in complementary ways, other times in ways that only their particular methodology can do. For some, scientific study can lead them away from their faith, as their erroneous understanding of real faith conflicts with their new scientific knowledge. Others, however, are led to faith through studying science.
It's very dangerous when people think, oh, we need to let science run free. Let science discover the world, and religion is just putting up roadblocks to science and holding it back. We have to be careful, because even though science says we can do something or we could do something, it doesn't follow we should do it. And that's where science requires ethics. Science tells us how the world works, but science can't tell us how we ought to live. Science can tell me how I could harvest organs from a person's body, but it doesn't tell me that I should. It doesn't tell me I should kidnap a healthy person and take their organs to help sick people. That's a question of ethics, of morality. And religion is part of that domain, to understand how we ought to live, how God made us. So in the question of embryonic stem cell research, I don't have a scientific objection, I have an ethical objection. I believe, and the church teaches, that human beings innocent human beings should not be carved up and killed for the benefit of other human beings. So if I were sick and I needed a heart to live, and you have a healthy heart, that doesn't give me the right to cut your heart out and take it and use it for my own endeavor, because you're a human being. And I would say those rights belong to all human beings. They belonged to you a year ago. They belonged to you when you were a child, when you were a newborn, when you were a fetus, an unborn child. You had those rights even when you were a zygote, which is a one-day-old cell, a one-day-old human being. Because our human rights, they are related to what we are, not how old we are or what we can do. So science, we have to be very, very careful that if you just let it try to get the results, it can oppress people. I mean, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a scientific tragedy called the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where African-American men were given placebos to track their syphilis, and they weren't given treatment because it's in the name of science. We have to figure out how this disease works. Oh, gosh. But they were mistreated. They were used as guinea pigs when they should have been treated like human beings. So it's fine to use science to discover things about the world, but don't say my opposition to things like embryonic stem cell research comes from ignorance. It comes from the full knowledge that this kills innocent human beings in the embryonic stage of life. And I just don't think we should kill any human beings, innocent human beings, regardless of what stage of life they're in, just to benefit science. Which I think is a fair-minded, common sense thing to think.
Absolutely, and it's the fact that they're human beings is also shown by science, or can be shown by science.
That is an indisputable fact of science. Indisputable. I mean, think about this. Ask someone how to define the words embryo or fetus. The only way you can define them is by saying they are the stage of development in an organism. So in human beings, a fetus refers to a human being in the 8th week of life until birth. And an embryo represents a human being from conception until the 7th week of life. So we know from science that the unborn are growing, they must be alive, and we know they have human DNA and human parents. And we know by observing them with scientific instruments, unborn children, from the time they're very small embryos, they're organisms. Their little parts function together for the good of the whole. So they're just a little human being like you and I, just as you and I need the right environment. You and I can't live if we're on the moon or the bottom of the ocean. We need the right environment, time, and nutrition to keep growing, to become mature members of the species. That's all the unborn need. They're not like sperm or egg or cancer cells. Those will always be sperm, egg, and cancer cells. Give them time, nutrition, and environment. That's all they are. But science shows us that the unborn, from after conception, from the moment of conception, once that process is successfully completed, are a whole human organism on a path of self-directed development. And my view is simply that all human organisms should have the same human rights. And that's a sensible view all people, religious or non-religious, should embrace.
Absolutely. Wow, I think you have very successfully smashed all of these myths. I think I want to thank you, Trent, for your great work. You've answered a lot of questions. If people want to know more about you, about your work, where can they go?
Sure, well, they can always visit my personal website, which is trenthorn.com, or they can go to the website for the organization I work for, Catholic Answers. They can go to catholic.com and search in the search bar, just search for Trent Horn, and you can find some of my previous magazine articles and writings, information about my book. And you can also listen to past radio shows where I allow atheists or people who support things like abortion to call in, and I charitably dialogue with them on a live radio show. And your viewers can see how we can engage those who disagree with charity and present them the truth. So they can go to trenthorn.com or catholic.com to learn more about what I do.
Excellent. Let me also show them this. This is Trent's book, Answering Atheism, How to Make the Case for God with Logic and Charity. My friends, we have once again been given a wealth of information, facts that prove the truth that comes from God and is taught by His Church. Have your opinions shifted during the course of our discussion? My hope is that you are more ready now to answer those tough questions that people have. Remember that in the Scriptures we learn that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by Him. We want to hear from you here at Truth and Lies. Let us know what other topics you'd like us to cover. You can do that at #TruthAndLies and visit us online at shalomworld.org/truthandlies. Until next time, my friends, go forth and spread the truth with love. God bless you.